Now moving on to something that's so important for you guys as you are in college, which is retrieval. Retrieval is a term for pulling out information out of your long-term memory when you need it. And so, for example, when you guys are taking tests, this is all about retrieval, right? You've been studying, you've been trying to encode the information, getting it into your long-term memory system. Now it's test time, and can you actually pull the information out? So, retrieval, if you want to think of this as some sort of definition, is a process that controls the flow of information from long-term memory to working memory so that you can then use it to actually operate in the world. Now, retrieval is different depending on what kind of long-term memory we're talking about. I've already made the distinction between explicit or declarative memory versus implicit or non-declarative memory. And of course, explicit memory, you could just ask people a question and see if they can actually produce the answer. Implicit memory is much more of an unconscious recollection, not a non-conscious, an unconscious recollection of a prior experience. And you can then actually test that by seeing its indirect effects on performance. So, for example, some sort of behavior would be an indication of this. Right now, we're just going to talk about explicit memory. So how do we test explicit memory? Well, there's some basic ways of doing this, and the most common two are free recall test versus a recognition test. Free recall test is if I were to just ask you guys on a test a completely open question, and I just see, without any sort of cues being given, I see what you guys can produce. So I might, for example, ask on a test, can you tell me about 2 ways of testing explicit memory? And you would then have to actively come up with free recall and recognition. So that's one way of testing explicit memory. The other way, that's very common, is recognition, right? It's a form of explicit memory retrieval in which items are presented to a person who must then determine if they were previously encountered or which one of them is correct. So a multiple choice question is an example of this. When I ask you guys a multiple choice question on the test, you don't have to come up with the answer because typically 4 different possibilities are given. You just got to recognize which one of those 4 is the correct one. So that is a recognition task. Sometimes people also try to study explicit memory by focusing on when people are making mistakes in retrieval, so retrieval failures. And one strange, curious case of that is, for example, a tip of the tongue phenomenon. And I don't know, you guys have, I'm sure, had this, when you're thinking of a word and you just can't get to it, or you're thinking of somebody's name and you just can't get to it. And what's interesting about these cases is that when they've managed to elicit those in the laboratory, which of course is difficult, oftentimes people can actually correctly produce the first and the last letter of the word. They can tell you if it's a shorter word or a longer word, but they just can't quite get to it. So that's sometimes another way in which explicit memory is at least being studied in the laboratory. The most common ways of using explicit memory or testing it is by free recall versus recognition, however. So what have we learned from some of these studies? Well, one interesting thing about explicit memory is that it's highly context dependent. What that means is that we are much more successful at retrieving information or retrieving memories if we're in the context in which we first stored that information. And to demonstrate that, here's a couple of interesting studies that they have done. And the first one is really just a case where it sounds like researchers need an excuse to go to Hawaii. But what they did is, let's say they went to Hawaii and they said, we're going to test to what extent memory is context dependent. How are we going to do this? Well, let's create 4 different groups of participants. In one group, they're going to study a list of words on the land, maybe on the beach, and then they're being tested on the beach. Second group, we're going to put them in a scuba suit and they're going to study on land and then they're going to be tested underwater. Third group, we throw them in the water first, have them study underwater, and then we'll test them on the land. And then the fourth group, we'll throw them in the water, have them study there, and then also test them underwater. What did they find? Well, if you look at the number of words that people recalled from the word list that they were studying, It is not the case that studying or testing on land was any better, studying or testing on the water was necessarily any better, but it was really about the link between where they had studied and where they were tested. For those who studied on the land, they recalled more words when they were also tested on the land versus on the water. Whereas for those who studied on the water, they also recalled more words if they were tested on the water rather than on the land. So this is what's called an interaction effect, meaning memory really is dependent on the context. The more the context of studying matches the context of being tested, the better people do. And it doesn't matter whether we're on land or on the water, it's really about just the overlap in the context of studying. A second demonstration that shows this too is that you can do the same thing by having a room smell like rosemary or lemon, and then either they're tested in the same smell room or in a different smell room, and you see that especially in this case it seems that the rosemary was very salient and actually led to a memory benefit, that if people studied with rosemary smell and were tested with it, they actually did substantially better than if they were studying with rosemary and then being tested with lemon. So same sort of idea, the more there's an overlap in context, the better people did. Not only does external context matter in this regard, so it's not just about, being on the land or on the water or what it smells like, but it's actually also about your own state. We have our internal state, right? Are you feeling happy? Are you feeling sad? And so forth. And it turns out that if you compare how well people do, if they happen to be happy when they're studying versus sad when they're studying, and then if they happen to be happy when they're being asked to recall information or sad when they're supposed to be recalling information, the bottom line is, if you feel happy while you're studying, you better make damn sure that you're feeling happy when you're being tested. And if you feel like crap when you're studying, you better make sure you don't feel so well either when you're being tested. It's all about the overlap in your state, and your memory is going to depend on it. The more of an overlap there is, the better people do.